Welcome, everybody. It is June still. We're not in July. We're almost at July. And it is the latest opportunity for us to get together for the CAR-PGA virtual panel. I'm your host, Mike Tresca. Very excited to speak to our guest, who we'll get to in a minute. But I also want to just cover off on our ongoing business as always. Our question still stands. We haven't gotten a lot of traction on this, so I'm going to keep pushing it because I think there's definitely value in the CAR-PGA membership discussing it, which is really talking about the value of ratings and systems. I know Hawk Robinson has provided some information which we'll share, but we'd love to see your thoughts as to what would we propose, if anything, or resources at least, if publishers want to use a rating system, what would that look like? Because I know for sure there are both members who've been working on something like that, as well as there's third-party attempts to set up rating systems. And there's lots of good reasons for why there should potentially be rating systems, at least not the least being that any kind of standard helps legitimize the industry. It actually came up because Wizards of the Coast at some point had real concerns about the open game license being used in a negative way. And I think part of that, I mean, I can't say that because I don't specifically know their thinking behind it, but I believe part of that is motivated by the fact that there's just not a lot of industry standards in terms of identifying content. So don't forget that. The question's still out there. If you get the chance, feel free. And I invite you to cover that when you get the opportunity. You can send the note to us. We'll put it in the newsletter, or you can put it, certainly connect on any of the social media where we have a presence on Facebook or LinkedIn or in our Google group. And with that, I am happy to invite our guest onto the screen as soon as I find him on the screen. Nick Proctor, hello. There you go. Hello.
Hi.
You are now officially, even though we knew you were there, now you're on screen, so that counts. Welcome, Nicholas Proctor. I'm very excited to have you join us, and I appreciate it. I feel like this took us a little bit to schedule, partially because of our scheduling time frame, but I know you're busy as well, so I appreciate you taking the time. And love to hear a little bit about how you sort of, we're going to take a journey with you, I hope. But would love to hear how you got started in sort of your gaming background. We do that just because that gives us a little bit of a grounding and commonality, and then we'll take it from there in the fantastic work you're doing with historical role-playing games and reacting to the past.
Sure. Well, I think that I started gaming probably when I was about 9 or 10. And my real introduction to gaming were hex-based war games from Avalon Hill and SPI in the 1980s. So that was one of the things that really got me interested in history, because my day job is as a historian, because the playing historical war games in particular really taught me that history is more about things that could have happened than just the things that happened. So all of those ideas about contingency and causation really stayed with me as I became a practicing historian. And I always found wargaming engaging. I played RPGs also, but the RPGs that I played, the ones that I liked the most were the ones that really had very thorough world building, rather than kind of sketchy ones, because that looked the most like history to me. So the convergence of those things in my professional work is now I write, help edit, and organize the efforts of the Reacting Consortium, which publishes the Reacting to the Past series of historical role-playing games. Because the history is the richest world building of them all. And they're also great tools to use in classrooms because they help make real for students that history is not just opening the big book of fate and memorizing a bunch of stuff about what must have happened. But they see history as a high stakes series of decisions made with incomplete information rather than just the turning of the great wheel.
I love that, and I think you hit on something that's always interesting. This is the fog of war of sort of a lot of these games, which is, obviously, especially if they're historical, we know the outcomes, but trying to replicate these decisions in the context of lack of information requires you to put yourself sort of outside of yourself a little bit. And it also requires a little bit of, there's something to the game itself that has to allow that, right? In table, so Avalon Hill, I think, depending on how they did it, it was dice or randomization. So that was one of your fogs of war. Video games now, obviously, they can just conceal the information before you see it, right? So now it's a little bit easier. But it's a fascinating point because I think it's very easy, and I see this with my son in high school, where I was like, how could you not love history? It's amazing. Social studies, I don't call it social studies more, it's like global studies. And but one of the things that really I think is important is the two sides, and you hit on this. One is taking yourself and connecting it to current events, right? Saying like, wow, those kind of decisions, very often military, not only military, happen today in different formats. So connecting that. But then to your point, putting yourself in those shoes as to what was going on at that time. And that's really, I think, where people learn, right? We talk about this a lot on this panel is sort of how we get people to learn. And it's always interesting because I imagine that maybe there are people who play history-based games and don't walk away transformed. I don't know who that is. But I feel like you can't help but experience that. No matter any game I play, I'm always sort of just thinking about, the time and the setting. I mean, some of these, especially in the world wars, are particularly one of them that I think is, recent enough for us to comprehend. So was there a particular time frame of games and subset that you were interested in, or was it just in history in general?
It was pretty much history in general. And I think that when I was a kid, I gravitated, as lots of American boys do, to the military stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think once I was in university, I think that I got more interested in the political things. And since I've been working as a historian, it's probably shifted more into the cultural stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that I've evolved as a historian, and that's been reflected as a game player.
Absolutely, and it's certainly the maturity journey we all go on, right? So as you're a kid, you're like, yeah, let's see what happens when you blow this up, and then as you get older, you're like, no, let's see what happens when you don't blow things up, or let's see what the fallout is when you do blow it up. Which is always fascinating. I always say, the new kids are D&D players. The older players become Call of Cthulhu players because they know we're all going to die eventually, and we got to figure out how we're going to go out. But you don't think about that when you start, right? You're like, I want to be powerful and look at all the exciting things I can do with my power fantasy, which is fun. But yeah, so that's fantastic. So obviously, this sort of put you, as you pointed out, it put you on a path. What specifically in sort of the historical role playing, what elements did you see that you sort of took with you into this? Because that's a jump, right? So you like history, I got that. You like gaming, and then we went to where you were obviously incorporating it in sort of an academic fashion. So take us through a little bit of that.
Yeah, so I think that a lot of it, and a thing that role-playing games really get across better than any other teaching approach that I've used, is it's really tempting, especially when you're like 18 and know everything, to look back on the past and say, what a bunch of idiots. Why didn't they just do X, Y, Z? Because that to me is such a clearly superior, just like appeasement is dumb. Just don't let the Germans have the Sudetenland. Problem solved.
Right.
So when they're playing roles, particularly in a game that lasts multiple sessions, and they've got well-drawn biographies and well-drawn objectives, and they're in a historical context, I think that students really often see how hard it is for the historical actors, particularly in situations where the historical actors don't have all the information, and they're sort of fumbling around trying to do what seems to make the most sense in terms of their ideology. But that I think that some of the most satisfying games that I run are ones where the students do the same dumb stuff that the historical actors did and end up in a really similar situation.
Yeah.
But they understand why, as opposed to just thinking that they're fools.
Yeah, I always I've been watching Picard, which is fascinating to go back on Paramount and watch the new Star Trek, the old Star Trek now through new eyes, but older. And they talk about the Kobayashi Maru, where it's a training simulation, not supposed to win, and of course, you
Right.
know, they cheat and they win, you know. But it's always such a fascinating kind of conversation around it, because it is about, like, can you do it better? And frankly, the
Right.
point is not to do it better. It is to experience it, right? It is not to win. It is to experience potentially even failure, and understand how that failure, whatever the failed condition is. So how did you get that and bring this into the classroom? We've had a lot of folks on who have told us significant headwinds to sort of bring this in. I mean, maybe it's easier with history, but certainly we know there's a little bit of, sometimes it's skepticism, sometimes it's just frankly resources. How did you sort of come upon this kind of approach that obviously, I always say, like, for some reason we all get it, we know it works, but
Right.
it seems harder than it should be. Like, I'm not seeing a revolution in the industry where everybody does it, so something's stopping us. What was your secret to introducing it?
Yeah, I think that my secret in my classes was just sheer bullheadedness, where I was like, this is going to work, let's do it.
Yeah.
And it works for most students. There are some students that gaming in the classroom does not work for.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, in an interesting way, some of the students that really struggle the most with gaming in the classroom are straight A students. And they're straight A students because they figured out how to school. They
Yep.
know how to do it. And then you're throwing them in the situation that has a lot of uncertainty, where what other students are doing is going to have some impact on what they do, and they don't want to do that. The other bunch of students that often really struggles with it are students who've gotten so used to passive learning that they've been, especially now, where they spent a year and a half as black rectangles on some class's Zoom screen. And now they're in a situation where they have to do stuff, and they have to react to the situation, and they have to react to what other players are doing, and they don't like being put on the spot. That said, each of those populations is somewhere between like 3 to 5% of most of my classes. So that I have a pedagogy that's really hitting 90% plus in a positive way. You know, I'll settle for that, because there is no approach that's going to be a good fit for everybody. So I really try to put it right out in front when I'm teaching a class. Like, look, for 3 weeks, we're going to be playing games in this class. So this is what those are like, and know that that's going to happen. So if that sounds cool to you, you should stick. If that sounds scary to you, you should also stick, because it's going to be fun. But if you really think that you're going to have a problem thriving, then you should probably find another class. And in an interesting way, nobody sort of comes right out on the first day of class and says, hey, I'm going to lecture from some notes that I wrote 15 years ago and show you some PowerPoints that are walls of text. So, like, if that's cool with you, you should stay in the class. But if it's not, you should run in fear. That would be a really nice disclaimer to have at the beginning of more classes.
I There was a lot to unpack with what you just said, because I agree. My English, one of my English teachers used to say, the scarf and barf. It's like scarf
Right.
and barf. Scarf it up, barf it back up, and you know, hopefully it looks like the way you took it in. And to your point, some people are real good at that, and I can imagine when you go, guess what? It's going to be free form, and we're going to sort of, like, you know, that is significant. I've seen it. You know, I was in several cutting edge business training classes that were immersive,
Mm-hmm.
and some people lose it. Candidly, some people, like, full on are not okay with high stress, because, you know, a lot of
Right.
times these immersion, I'm not saying you do this, but a lot of these immersion programs are meant to show you what it is like in stressful situations, and role playing that is uncomfortable. And switching frames for students who are not used to switching frames, I could see being a real challenge. So I think it's fascinating, and it's certainly kudos to you for being clear, because I think, unfortunately, this is probably rare enough that people, if you haven't played role-playing games, which is like a whole different situation when this does come up, switching frames can be quite shocking for people who've never done it. And saying it up front, I think, is really great. So
yeah, in general, students roll with it.
yeah.
In terms of the growth of role-playing games in classrooms, there's actually more of an obstacle from instructors than from students. And I think that comes from two big places. One is a concern about content coverage, where if you're going to be playing a game, you don't have as much time to give your PowerPoint. The other one is loss of control, because if you're really letting the students stretch their wings and play a role-playing game, you don't have awareness of everything that's going on, of every interaction. You don't know what the students are going to do next. And things are not under your control. When you're lecturing from behind a podium, you're in total control of that space, or at least it looks like you're in total control. So I think both of those are big obstacles as well. So it's not just on the student side, it's on the faculty side too.
Yeah, and we've certainly heard that, which is essentially, to your point, there's constraints. And I mean, I don't begrudge people, right? There's time constraints, there's money constraints, there's expectations from parents and other educators, as well as their bosses, who are all basically saying, you know, I expect certain things to be done within a certain period of time. And that by far seems to be the biggest sort of flex killer, of where there are absolutely educators who would love to do more of this, but they are at such immense pressure with such a limited time frame that they're like, I can't risk it, that we're not going to cover everything.
And a lot of that, the place where those constraints are really the firmest in terms of places where reacting games might show up, are in public high schools.
Yep.
Private high schools, charter schools are overwhelmingly the kind of high schools that adopt our games. The places where it can fit into a public are in an AP class, because you have a little bit more leeway in terms of content coverage there often, but it's tough. You know, so the curricular constraints are there, but I think that also just in terms of classroom management, the idea that you're turning the class over to the students is really anathema to the way that a lot of high school teachers are trained. Absolutely.
And that's what we hear, right? And certainly that's what we see. As both as a parent as a student myself, I've seen it, where there's some classes where it seems like everybody's cool and they flex, and there's some classes where they literally are like, I got stuff to do, let's move it along. And again, of course, it also, you know, you've also got large classrooms and you know, large numbers of students, and that there's a lot of other and at very different spectrums of learning, and so I get it. You mentioned reacting to the past, so let's dig into that a little bit. So what is sort of, I mean, I think we got some of that, but if you could go into sort of what is reacting to the past and how you've implemented it in the classroom, that'd be great.
Sure. So reacting to the past games consist of three major components. One component is the game book, and that has historical context, rules for the game, and historical documents from the period. So that's the resource that everybody in the class gets, that explains the world of the game and how to operate in the world, as well as the big ideas, which is what every game is really designed to direct the players towards. So that's element one. Element two are the roll sheets. So every player gets a roll sheet, and that has a biography and objectives and assignments and advice. So that they're usually longish, but that's because reacting games usually run for 5 or 6 or 7 sessions of gameplay. The third component is the instructor's manual, which gives you as the game master all kinds of advice and direction about how to assign roles, which roles to assign first, which ones are optional, what are the key points in terms of providing historical context, because you might be teaching a game that's outside your area of expertise. So the games are designed to have a session or two of setup using traditional instruction, Then you turn the class over to the students. There's almost always a student who's acting as a master of ceremonies, and they move, they're in role at this point, and then you do the next 5 or 6 or 7 class sessions all in role. As the game master, you're sometimes doing the sorts of things that you would do in a tabletop game where you're injecting new information. You're saying, no, you can't do that. You're saying, hey, have you thought about doing this? But most of that you are doing privately by emailing people and passing notes and that sort of thing, so that the student-centeredness of it is really most preeminent. And then once the game ends, they usually build to some kind of a climax. Once the game ends, you then have at least one session of debriefing, which is important for de-rolling and sharing secrets, but also walking the players through how the things that they did match and don't match the historical record, and talking about, well, why did you do this? Well, why do you think that the historical actors did this? And then providing some information about what happened next, so they get a sense of how what they did affected the flow of history. Most of the games take a bite out of a larger development. So like we have a French Revolution game that's really popular. It ends before the terror begins, and the revolution really moves into a hyper radical phase. So that's good in that you then talk about the terror and then the coming of Napoleon, etc. And all of that then makes perfect sense to students, because they're like, oh yeah, things were going to get a lot more radical if we played for another session. And oh yeah, if there was the opportunity for a reactionary rightward movement, I would have supported that. So,
Yeah.
so they get why the ebbs and flows happen, because they sort of have ridden the first few waves. But that's also a way that you can get away from players doing too much of an in-game strategy where they're anticipating a certain outcome, is where you bookend the game, where the game ends usually is not at the end of the historical development. So like we have a game about the American Revolution that's set in New York City. The game ends at the end of 1776. And the winner is determined by who controls New York City, the loyalists or the patriots. Students have no idea who controls New York City at the end of 76. And it really is anybody's game. So that's a game where oftentimes the players playing loyalists are kind of depressed at the beginning, because they're like, we're going to lose.
Right.
But then when you explain the game and where it's going to end to them, they're like, oh, well, maybe we can do that. And then you have to talk to the Patriots, because they're all overconfident by this point. And they're sort of like, oh, we're so going to win. And it's like, well, I wouldn't be too sure. And then you talk to, almost every reacting game has some roles that are called indeterminants, which are roles that are pursuing their own agendas, but they don't necessarily have a set position on the big issues, like on the issue of independence. So in the case of the New York game, indeterminants include women with property, propertyless white men, and enslaved black men. And they can all cut in different directions to follow what their best interests are. So this is one of the things that is really the most important aspect of reacting games, is there's basically a kind of an in-game jury that are listening to the arguments and paying attention to the situation, and where they move is what's going to determine the balance of power as the game goes on.
Wow, that's fascinating. So this is not as simple as I'm role playing a role and I sort of just go through it and the outcome is fixed, number one. And then also to your point, obviously people bring their biases and their assumptions about history and sort of outcomes. And, first of all, I think the game's not fixed that way, right? So the outcome could sway any direction. Are these played with end goals in mind, or is it really just to see where you end up based on how the game
It
plays?
depends on the game. Some games are much more open-ended in terms of the final outcome. Others, it's one of the phrases that we use in the reacting community is the plausibility corridor. How wide is your plausibility corridor? So some it's pretty narrow, others it's pretty wide, but it always has to be historically plausible that that's a thing that might have occurred. And how wide it is going to be determined largely by where you're deciding the game is going to stop.
The framework of reacting to the past gives us enough, certainly, to the mix of both role-playing game, or role play, probably is a better way to put it, and sort of the traditional lecturing and engaging with it. So there's a consortium. How is that? So how does that work, right? So how does that, so I'm sold, right? I'm ready to do it.
Right.
Show me the way. What is the path to engaging with this, depending on, be it an educator, an educational institution, or a student, if even?
Yeah, so we're mainly educator facing. So we have now about 30 different titles in print. They're published by University of North Carolina Press. So that's really important because it means that the scholarship is good, that they're historically reliable. So what usually happens is a faculty member will just assign a game or games for a class, and then all of their students get the book in physical or e-copy. Once you've assigned a game, you can then get the roll sheets and instructors materials from our website. So that enterprising students don't go swipe roll sheets of their opponents, we have to protect all that stuff and make sure that you're a bona fide instructor.
Right.
So if you assign a game, you can always get the materials for that game. In order to get access to all the materials, because we also have a couple dozen games in development on the website. So those are pre-publication. In order to get access to those games, people become members of the consortium. Or their institution gets an institutional membership to the consortium. So that's good. But in terms of making sure that our servers stay up and that kind of thing, it's really the memberships that take care of that. But we also want to make sure that games that are in development get a lot of play testing, so that we can make sure that they work at a variety of institutions with a variety of different disciplines and that sort of thing. So it's a really critically important part of the ecosystem that people are using those games before they're published.
Right. So how do you get in this? How do you get in there? Like, I've got a great game. I think it's going to be very educational. How does one submit such a thing?
Yeah, so the starting point on our website, which is reactingconsortium.org, is you go there, and then there are several drop-down menus. One of them is materials for game designers. So there are templates. There are some little short letters about how to deal with divisive issues, how to sort of what the different components of a reacting game are. And then at the very bottom of that is a site where you can submit your idea for a game. So this was a thing that I built a long time ago because I was fresh out of graduate school, and I had the graduate student fear that somewhere somebody was writing my dissertation and was going to get it done before I did. So mainly this was to make sure that that didn't happen for games, so that you kind of are able to put your marker down on a particular thing. We then have an editorial board that is in charge of reviewing and giving feedback for games as they advance. So we have a really robust community, and a big part of that is people doing peer reviews of games in development. So by the time that something actually comes to press, it's gone through 2 rounds of anonymous peer review.
Wow. That is going to be a wake up call for some. I used to work on peer review because I used to work in a department at Michigan State, and gaming is probably already sort of an open Wild West. So having a peer review, I imagine, is quite an eye-opening experience for some designers. So
yeah, it is, and I think that in an interesting way, a lot of the people that write reacting games really don't do recreational RPG.
mm-hmm.
They really come at it primarily from an educational approach. And I think that what you're talking about is part of it, which is, if I'm DMing a traveler campaign, I can throw some stuff together and we can start playing and it's pretty good.
Yeah.
But in order to get something published as reacting, it really goes through an extraordinary amount of scrutiny and feedback. But because of that, I think that's part of why we've been successful getting non-gamers to use our games, because we can say, okay, yeah, it's a game. It's also a peer-reviewed tool for learning. And that makes it less intimidating or sketchy for a lot of people.
Well, you also know a little about this because you wrote a book. I don't know how much that book interacts with this kind of sort of philosophy, but can you talk a little bit about what the Game Designer's Handbook is? And I mean, beyond the obvious self-explanatory title.
Yeah, well, I mean, mainly what it was is it was an opportunity for me to kind of work out a lot of my thinking about what reacting games are and how they're different from other RPG. What it's evolved into, I think it's in like its fourth edition at this point, is much more of me thinking about that, but also over the course of the life of that book, there's been so much more good stuff written by scholars about RPG, in both educationally and recreationally. So I've sort of tried to borrow a lot of wisdom from the LARP world and from the tabletop RPG worlds to incorporate into the design, as well as working for the editorial board and reading and playing dozens and dozens of reacting games over the years. But really, so the Game Designer's Handbook is not an official statement of reacting design principles. It's more, these are a whole bunch of ideas that have helped me as a designer. Because I guess I've got, I don't know, 5 games that I wrote or co-wrote or published now, and I've got 4 more at different stages of development. So I think a lot about how to structure reacting games. So I just wanted to share that because a lot of it was I kept getting in conversations with people, and was like, wow, it would be nice if there was an easier way to, for them to get this information rather than having to come have lunch with me at a conference somewhere.
Yeah, I imagine you get asked probably over and over similar questions, right? Because this is definitely both not new, but is new in the context of an evolution of sort of an approach that certainly I've seen it before, but having it codified and standardized, I think, is enormously important. And to your point, certainly in education, critical for legitimacy.
Well, and I think that that's really one of the balances that we have right, but that we always have to keep an eye on, is you want to have series standards that are high enough and an editing process that is rigorous enough so that you've got really good, reliable games. On the other hand, you don't want to get so strict that you're suffocating innovation, right? Because somebody might come up with a new way to think about playing a role or a very different kind of assignment. Like I want to have students make a short film instead of giving speeches. So we're constantly sort of checking ourselves to go, okay, we still believe in all these standards. Is there any way in which this is shutting down potential good ideas? So we're investigating a number of different ways of delivering games, sort of in print and electronically, and some different forms of games and that sort of thing. But the heart and soul of reacting is really these immersive full-length games.
have obviously this is the educational space. Has there been any consideration, or is it being used this way for like scouting organizations, libraries? Have there been any other groups, sort of not traditional mainstream academics, that have sort of had because I could see it. Certainly in both cases, we've had librarians talk about this, and we've certainly, there's a scouting merit badge for both Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, but tends to be real loose, right? So it sounds like there's opportunities there, but I didn't know if that's ever come up at all.
Yeah, it has, and people have tried it with different things. I think that the biggest non-academic space where it's been used successfully is with Rhodes Scholar, which used to be Elder Hostel. So this sort of continuing education for retirees, because they're highly motivated, they find it engaging.
Yeah, sure.
I think that the tough part of it is to think of it in terms of like a fantasy RPG, the lore is so thick that getting players that are playing for fun to spend multiple hours figuring out what's going on with the French Revolution and how their role fits into it. And when their role is sort of mundane by RPG standards, it's like, you don't have superpowers. If you can get these people to agree, maybe you can execute somebody, but that's it. That's a big ask for recreational gamers, because I think that recreational tabletop people are gaming to have fun, and immersing yourself in a world is part of that, but reacting is definitely moving into the homework zone.
Right.
Nordic LARP, often they have really thick world building in very complicated roles, but they have people who show up and are like, yeah, I haven't read anything, let's play. So Alan White is working with some folks to simplify some reacting designs and use some off-the-shelf gaming mechanics to see if they work. And that's one of the experiments that we're running, is sort of how simplified can you make a game and still have it be a reacting game?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And to your point, the tension between, again, always new people, welcome them in, but still trying to achieve a goal where they learn something that hopefully is in the continuum of the rest of the course. And at the other end, you can dive back in and give all that detail. I always laugh because we're like, only in gaming do we have thicker rule books than instruction manuals for driving and piloting aircraft. You're like, learn this is amazing. You're gonna love it. Here's like 3 books that are at like 600 pages. My favorite example of that is I had to buy bookshelves that were made for lawyers. That's the only thing that could handle my books, because everything. And I was like, but just to be clear, that's how heavy the book is. Like, that's how heavy these books are. So, I do want to be sensitive to time. I know Alan's on, and we have some other folks on, Trevor as well. So. I do want to give him a chance to ask you some questions, but before we do that, what's next for you, and where can we sort of follow this amazing journey? I mean, I think we already know. We know your book. We know Reacting to the Past, but what's next, and where else can we find what's next for you?
Yeah, well, I'm working on a couple games right now. One of them is about the escalation of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, sort of 63 through 67. Another one is about post-Civil War Reconstruction in Louisiana. So that's a game that has all kinds of dimensions. In particular, I wanted to design a game where most of the roles weren't white guys, which a lot of reacting games are.
Yeah.
And then I'm working with a little company called Experiential Simulations to design a 1-session game that's delivered by browser, so you can play on your phone. And there's not a paper book. Everything pushes electronically. So we really debuted that this past June at the Reacting Conference in New York. So that was exciting. So I've got a bunch of irons in the game development fire. And but I also, as executive director, am mainly trying to help other people to work on their projects. And in terms of like I don't have I'm too busy writing and playing games to have much of an electronic social media
This is a
presence.
trend with you academics. I'm always trying to tell you you need a website, and they're like, "Yeah, I'm busy."
Yeah. I mean, like I have a Facebook page, but I don't really use it. That but I will say though that for the reacting community is that we have a really very vibrant closed chat space on Facebook called the Reacting Faculty Lounge. Uh, you have to be like clearly not an undergraduate student in order to get on it, because people type candidly about what's going on in their classrooms.
Sure, yeah.
But right now, I think it has 2,000 members, so there's a lot of people. It's also really handy for people that are using a game for the first time and something weird is happening. If you type a message onto that group, usually within a couple hours, you've got 2 or 3 responses giving you some advice about it. So that is my primary social media presence, is answering questions on that.
That's fantastic. And you're on Twitter, right?
No, I don't have. Oh, Reacting has a Twitter handle. Yeah.
Yes. So I saw that. That's right. That's fantastic.
Instagram too. Yeah. Noah Trujillo, who is our digital resources manager, does most of that stuff. It's not really my bag.
Excellent. And how can we support you then? Before we take anything we should be doing, the CAR-PGA. Obviously, this is very near and dear to the CAR-PGA. What is there anything that we should consider engaging or sharing that would be helpful?
Yeah, well, some of the materials that we're developing for our website to share out among reactors in general. Alan White is working on developing some resources that are safety mechanisms, safety techniques. We also have some people working on accessibility issues. We also have some people working on developing materials about inclusion in the classroom, sort of playing across ethnicity, but also different kinds of learners and that sort of thing. So I think in terms of the expertise and knowledge that you've developed about how to handle it in a gamer space, that if going down the road, you all could look at some of the stuff that we've developed and give us some pointers and direction on it, that would be great. You should also, you and your members should try sometime to come to a Reacting conference. Mostly we play games because we do play testing there, but we also introduce, our conferences are usually about half newcomers and half veterans. So they're to introduce people to the pedagogy, but it's also to refine materials for the pedagogy. But mainly it's like hilarious fun.
That sounds like. When's the next one? When
the next one is the Game Development Conference, which is going to be at Oregon State University in Corvallis. That's going to be in mid-July. And then we may have a regional conference in fall. The next big conference is going to be in early January, which will be via Zoom. And that'll be hosted by University of Georgia at Athens.
Excellent. All right, so I will open the chat up. We have one person's name was brought up a few times. I wonder if he'll speak up. So feel free, Trevor, Alan, if you'd like to speak, if you have any questions.
Yeah, I just want to say that I find it fascinating. I'm actually hoping that Alan is successful with his migrating this to a smaller format or a tabletop format, because I have several friends who are big history buffs, and playing in a historical world and sort of working things out and seeing how you compare to the reality is an interesting construct. The Canadian in me really wishes that there was one that had to do with Louis Riel and the opening of the West in Canada.
Right.
I'm not a history guy, so I can't possibly create it, but it'd be really cool to see that. My question is, barring that you have mostly history people, I'm presuming in your classroom, being a post-secondary education, I'm wondering whether you're having any issues with presentism, or whether you're finding that the game themselves actually help to break the bias of presentism.
Oh, that's a great question. Most of my classes that I use reacting in are actually general education. So usually no more than 15% of the people are history majors or minors. Usually half of them are kind of interested in history. And then the other half are fulfilling a requirement. In terms of presentism, I think that this is a fascinating thing, because the closer that a game setting gets to the present, the more trouble the students have setting aside their presentist assumptions about what's going on. So, like, for example, if I were to run a game about US immigration policy in the late 20th century, a lot of them would just assume that they understand what the issues are because they figure those are what the issues are now, and if they had a role that took a different position, they would have a hard time playing that role, because they would be like, I really object to, like, I'm not a nativist, so I can't play a nativist. The thing that I found, so one of the games in the series, the kind of granddaddy game, is called Threshold of Democracy, which is about Athenian democracy. And one of the issues in that game is the issue of medics. So a medic is somebody who is ethnically Greek, but both of your parents need to be Athenians in order for you to be an Athenian citizen. So the medics are people who maybe were born in another city or were born to only one Athenian parent, but they're part of Athens. So this is a little part of the game, and one of the players is a medic, and that person contributed a lot to kicking up the Spartans. And the Democrats say he's earned his citizenship, basically. So in that game, you can have these big arguments about whether the medic should get citizenship or not. And people oppose it because they see that it's going to give the Democrats power, because he's probably going to align with them. But some people don't like it because he's rich, so he might align with the oligarchs. So there's this sort of hot, that it's a hot issue, and they struggle with it. So you play through the game and you have good arguments about medic rights and this kind of thing. 9 times out of 10, it's not until I'm doing the debriefing and I say something like, well, how did our debate about medics compare with contemporary debates about undocumented immigrants? And the students are like, it is like that, like it has not occurred to them up until that point. And I think that that's because building the world of democratic Athens, where there are all these different issues going on, they lose track of the commonalities, because they very much get the way that democracy works in ancient Athens is not the way that democracy works in the contemporary US. So they sort of get vested in that world, but they don't see that you can port a lot of the arguments in that game into contemporary America until you really point it out to them. This always surprises me. I'm like, was the bright neon line between then and now like not visible to you? And they're like, yeah, didn't see it. So I think it's really, really helpful in terms of getting them to look at contemporary issues differently when they look at very similar issues in a historical context.
That's why we learn from history, right?
Right.
That's yeah. I mean, and absolutely, I could see that being an issue where either people think they know about it and therefore come to the conversation with preconceived notions, or to your point, it's so close. I mean, it's funny because one of the questions in the site is, I really, really don't like the person I'm supposed to role play.
Right.
And I imagine that comes from a lot of thinking you know about the character or the person, and especially as we get closer to the more recent times, you think you do. You think you know the issues.
Well, and I think that one of the things that I struggle with in terms of designing roll sheets is that I'm not expecting players to sympathize with the position that they're being asked to play, but I do want them to understand it. So I think that distinction is a thing that students initially struggle with, but then almost always understand. Is, you know, this loathsome person that I'm being asked to play, he thinks that he's the hero. So, like, why does he think that? Because I think that it's also part of the present mindedness that's easy to fall into, where you're like, oh yeah, these people, they're just evil and small-minded and not really worth understanding. But when you look at somebody who is really who's really intellectually brilliant, but is coming to conclusions that you utterly disagree with, I think that's a tremendous opportunity for learning, rather than just going, well, all of this is garbage. But I think that's also why doing the debriefing is really essential, and doing the de-rolling is really essential, because it's important to give players who are playing those roles in particular an opportunity to make sure that the rest of class recognizes, I was just playing a really, really good version of this awful person. This is not what I actually think.
Right.
And then usually, if usually the other students are like, thank you for being truly awful, because without that to push against, we wouldn't have really engaged in this world as much as we did.
Right. And again, this is new for some people, right? Role players are probably going, yeah, I play terrible people all the time. But it's certainly, you know, depending on where you've been in education, and you're in a group setting with students and people, maybe you want them to like you later. It's different with friends, right? So there's just a lot of different dynamics that, and you know, we didn't even get into ethnicity, race, or anything else, where you may have very specific concerns about how you're presented when you do these things. So, so Alan, did you have a question? I don't know if you had something you wanted to ask. We keep talking about you.
You did. Well, and I hope people can come to GameholeCon. So we'll be trying it. It's Nick's game, by the way. Chicago 1968 is one of the games that we're going to be trying to modify and see how it works out.
Do you want to give the dates for that, Alan? Just to
for GameholeCon? Let me check really fast. It's October. I think it's third weekend of October.
And one of the things we'll do is we'll take all the information. We'll check with you, Nick, to make sure we have it right, and we'll put it in the newsletter, and we'll put it in the show notes as well. So
Gamehole is October 19th through the 22nd in Madison, Wisconsin.
Oh, nice.
So
excellent.
But Nick, I was just going to say, you were mentioning safety tools, and did you want to say something about North Carolina Press and the revisions that we're going through for as we go to them to modify some of the reacting games as they're updated?
Yeah, well, some of the reacting games are 25 years old at this point. So in addition to bringing out a steady stream of new games, we're trying in a really thoughtful way to make new editions of some of those old games. So the one of those that's coming down the pike, the first is a game about Charles Darwin. And the central question of that is, should he win the Copley Prize, which is like the big English natural science prize? And that's a tricky game, because really what the game is about is how science knows things and what scientific evidence is, and the degree to which Darwin's theory is based upon scant evidence, because the fossil record is really limited, and was even more limited in the 19th century when he was writing. So, but students with the first edition really wanted to turn it into a faith v science fight. And that's one of those issues along the lines of what Trevor brought up that is a live wire in contemporary American politics. So they kind of gravitated to that because it's about evolution, which is a contemporary teaching issue, that the historical displacement wasn't enough. One of the other aspects of that game was some roles that dealt with a lot of 19th century race pseudoscience. And what ended up happening is a lot of people, including me, just didn't play with those roles because of all the ways in which it could have gone sideways. But this potentially loses something in the game because the same society that is saying, Charles Darwin, should you get this medal or not, is also taking these guys seriously as scientists because of the racist qualities of 19th century English science.
Mm-hmm.
So a big part of the new edition is figuring out how to get those ideas into the game in a way that people are not going to use it to make a racist argument that they want to make as them, but sort of use the role as a puppet for it. Or to like not have this in the game at all, but to have it as part of the setup and the debriefing so that everybody knows that this is part of the situation. But for a lot of reasons, we've decided to play a version of the game without it. So a lot of this is just to provide game masters with more options about how to deal with particularly touchy subjects. Because we don't want to whitewash the history. On the other hand, we don't want to have a classroom that becomes a traumatic place for people.
Right.
So that's one of the other never-ending conversations in the Reacting Consortium is where is the balance?
One of my favorite, it just came out recently, The Atlantic did an article about people who don't like the game. And one of the things that came out from one of the authors doing the interviews of people who don't like the game was that gaming is a very fast way to know about someone. It takes shortcuts. So when you game with someone, you're going through scenarios and you learn a lot about them. And I've heard this, that people are like, I actually don't like to role play because it tells a lot about me. And now you can imagine if people have biases or things that maybe they didn't even know they had, these things can come out in a classroom setting. And then sort of now you've opened up a Pandora's box of things that maybe wasn't intentional, but as Trevor was mentioning, the presentism is you're bringing people it's very difficult for them not to bring some part of themselves. It's just a question of what comes out and how it comes out. You know, it is a little bit, I always say we're playing with sort of primal elemental things. People know how to role play. We've been doing it forever around a fire, but it also is very much a storytelling and a very much an emotional engagement that, as much as we want to put these boundaries around it, is very much a person bringing some part of themselves into the game and now into the classroom.
And that's one of the big challenges, because when I play role-playing games for fun, I'm almost always playing with people that I know, and sometimes they're people that I've known for 15 years.
Right.
When you're playing a reacting game, most of which deal with difficult issues, and at least in some part, you're playing with somebody who you didn't know 2 weeks ago.
Right.
And your interaction has consisted of sitting next to that person for 2 weeks. And then it's sort of like, hey, you need to become bitter enemies. And it can be hard, especially if you don't have any experience at all with role playing. Figuring out where the role stops and the person starts is big. So in addition to looking at the game materials themselves, we're trying to have more safety tools to use in general for any reacting game to help cushion that. So that, because for me, like a lot of the games have a competitive element, there are winners and losers. For me, any reacting game is essentially a collaborative thing, because you're all building the world of the game together. and sort of thinking of it that way is like we've built a world, and now we're going to see what happens in it. That's pretty easy for me to believe because I play a lot of games. It's a big ask for somebody who's never played a game before.
Absolutely. And in a lot of ways, this is the maturation of both gaming, role playing, and now role playing in academia and sort of that environment, right? Where there, to your point, there are boundaries, there's guidelines, there's goalposts that we have to all be sensitive to and that we come into. And this is a different environment. So as you experiment and as it gets implemented more, these things are going to come up. So I think it's great. Right. It's fantastic that this is being addressed. And it's certainly being addressed in the wider role-playing community, at least partially because gaming has become now role-playing gaming has become so popular. It now represents a very diverse group that maybe wasn't as diverse before, and frankly needs some of these tools that the white guys didn't need or thought they didn't need. So we're now we're in a new world, which is, we're growing up. This is part of the nature of it, but it can be uncomfortable. So I think that's fantastic. And I'm glad, critically it's being brought up because it's important. It's important. Like the last thing you want is somebody to go, I didn't want to play this game anyway. And now I'm playing this person and they're secretly using their agenda against me. I mean, there's just a lot of ways that could go wrong. So I think it makes sense to review it. So that's great.
Yeah.
Well, look, I want to be, we're over time, but you were generous. I know we had an outage there, so I appreciate you taking the time. Anything you want to touch on that we missed, any last words that we didn't cover?
I don't know. This was pretty thorough. I guess I would just reaffirm that the Reacting Facebook group and the Reacting conferences are hilarious fun. And they're also composed of people who are really dedicated to teaching, not just with games, but in general. So I think that the vast majority of people that come into those spaces have a really positive experience, even if they never end up using a game. So I think that's one of the things that keeps me excited and energized about Reacting, especially if I go to a traditional academic conference, which is just like, I don't know, sand and molasses combined, and as unpleasant a way. Yeah, it's just sort of like they did not light me up. Whereas every time I come away from a Reacting conference, I'm exhausted because it's nonstop and it's engaging, but I'm also energized because being in a room with that many people that are that excited about serving their students in the best way they can, that's just a terrific feeling.
When it happens, it is magical. It is magical. Yeah. We're all just trying to get back to those games that we all know that when it happens, it's unbelievable, and you never forget it. It's a lived experience essentially that you're going through. So
yeah, well, so this is a thing that we didn't touch on and it gets back to the coverage versus depth issue of people adopting it. When I run into a student, sometimes many years after a class, like I remember the last time I did this, I was crossing the street at the farmer's market. And I recognized the cop who was directing traffic, and it was a student of mine from like 10 years before, and I kind of waved, but then like I was coming back through and he was on break or something, was just standing on the curb. And I was like, hey, how's it going? And we did some small talk. And then I was like, dude, like what all do you remember from the class that you took with me? He'd only taken one class. And he was like, oh yeah, the French Revolution. And I was like, all right. And he was like, those Jacobins. And he like went off on them, and there was a degree to which he was like right back in that classroom because it was experiential. It was also emotional because he was really frustrated with what they were doing and that sort of thing. And it was also like I kind of followed up and I was like, so like what were you mad about in terms of what they were doing? And he was like, well, the way that they interpreted active and passive citizenship was just wrong. So he had the content. Right. It wasn't just the kind of raw emotion. So that's always stuck with me because I'm like, at no point have I run into a student who took me for one class 10 years later. And I'm like, remember that lecture I gave on the Etruscans? You know, wasn't that awesome? You know, how they had wood architecture versus, you know, like this is not a thing that happens. But when I run the games, like they utterly remember it. Not always completely positively, but they always think of it as an important part of their education.
That's fantastic. We couldn't end on a better note. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, including the technical challenges that we faced, which is new for us, but I mean, we overcame it. I appreciate you getting back on. I really think this is, you're absolutely doing cutting edge and important work. Any way that CAR-PGA can assist and support, we will. We will certainly, so this video will be online. It's being recorded. We will then take, we'll have a bio and summary with relevant links. So we'll be able to go to those pieces as well, and we'll share it with our membership. Thank you so much. Don't go anywhere. We'll stop the recording in a second, but I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you again, Nick.
Thanks for having me. I really had a good time.
Thank you.